Good evening. My name is David Elwood. I'm the Dean of the Kennedy School, and I want to welcome you here to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. This is the ultimate forum event of this calendar year, and it's ultimate in many different senses. It is, of course, the ultimate in the classic last one of the semester, as classes and exams have just now completed. But it's an ultimate in another sense. It's the time when we have come together to celebrate the naming of the Business and Government Center, the Bijan and Sharmeen Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And I want to say a couple of words about two of them and ask them to stand just a moment. Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani is a quite remarkable man, and in many ways symbolizes the kind of careers and opportunities and directions that I think all of us aspire to for our students. And he is one of our students because he really has spanned the world of business, of government, of the nonprofit sector, and many others. He comes from a prominent family in Iran, a family that has been remarkably successful through many, many generations and many, many regimes in maintaining its influence, its significance, and its credibility, and continues to do so today. He came to the United States to, I believe it was Bijan, when you went to Princeton, and where he was a very successful student. He returned home and to do his military service, but in lieu of military service, he joined the civic society, or civil society, and joined an educational institution conveniently owned by his family's newspaper, and then became a journalist and started writing extraordinary articles about energy and the energy sector. So extraordinary that the government asked him to also join in their work on energy planning and become one of their delegates to OPEC, which he did during day, and at night he'd then write very objective, independent, and sometimes, I guess, quite maddening articles about what the country and the world should be doing about oil and energy and so forth. And nonetheless, he managed to maintain his independence as well as his credibility throughout this period. He came back to go to the Kennedy School, where he was a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and graduated from the Kennedy School in 1982. And he began working in one of our centers, in fact, a center that is in some sense a predecessor or was independent of the Center for Business and Government at the time. And this was where he was the assistant, this is, by the way, our Energy and Environmental Policy Center, where he was the Assistant Director for International Energy Studies. And he did that work and continued to go on and met with various people. He was one of these people who knew a great deal about the real world and so therefore was in much demand. Ultimately was spotted by a private firm, Apache, and brought to work for Apache. It was an oil and gas firm, and he quickly became the very senior president there, and eventually created his own company called Mondoil that does a great deal of energy work in West Africa. And, but throughout this time, he maintained a close association both with the school and the community. Indeed, he was one of the people very deeply involved in the procurement of energy resources for Citizens Energy Corp. That was Joe Kennedy's firm that was designed to bring low-cost energy sources to the poor, something we desperately need this year, as many people are well aware. He's on a variety of boards. He's definitely a remarkable man, and so it is a great honor that we take complete credit for his 1 year here, for his remarkable success, both before and after coming here. And I have to say, there is perhaps only one person that can possibly top Bijan, and that's Sharmeen. And Sharmeen is also from Iran, and the strongest evidence, I'll say something again later, but the best evidence that Bijan is a remarkable man is that he early on identified her as a potential person to go to Princeton and worked hard to recruit her to go to Princeton and did so successfully. He ultimately recruited her for other opportunities as well. But she was wildly successful there, went on to Stanford where she got an MS. She joined Ryan Financial Services, became a vice president of portfolio management at Lehman Brothers, Senior Vice President, Director of Fidelity Management Trust, and she became the Chief Investment Officer of the Fixed Income Group. She joined Goldman Sachs in 1993 as a partner in asset management, and she's now a Managing Director. She's a remarkably diverse and thoughtful and woman of extraordinary judgment. She's also on the National Advisory Board of the Mirage Foundation of the American Dream. And again, a person of extraordinary vision, ideas, and already today she's said 2 or 3 things that she's talking about. Oh, we can do this, we can do that. This is a magnificent team that will be part of, I hope, our magnificent team. We have a great deal of work to do at the Center for Business and Government. So I'd like to ask the 2 of you to stand so we can give you a hand for your very, very generous gift. I guarantee you that 95% of our interactions are going to be great, and 5% they're going to make me crazy because they're going to have such high standards and high demands. Last reason this is the ultimate forum event is tonight's speaker. And this is also someone who has been extraordinary in his capacity to move across sectors, cover powerful and important and critical topics. And he is someone that I'm very much looking forward to doing. What can I say? Juan Enriquez is a best-selling author. He wrote the book As the Future Catches You, How Genomics and Other Forces Are Changing Your Life, Work, Health, and Wealth. And it was selected by Amazon's editors as one of the best business books of the year. He's got a new book, The Untitled States of America, Polarization, Fracturing, and Our Future. He's a businessman. And I hope he'll say 1 or 2 words about his new business because it's quite extraordinary. And I'm tempted to tell you about it, but I'll get it wrong. He's the chairman and CEO of Biotechonomy. Is that proper pronunciation? It's a life science research investment firm. He's also on the board of the Cabot Corporation, but it's remarkable. He's an academic. He was a founding director of Harvard Business School's Life Sciences Project, recognized by the Business School Interactive Harvard Business School Interactive as one of the best and most charismatic teachers of HBS. He's been a government official, CEO of Mexico City's Urban Development Corporation, Coordinator General of Economic Policy, and Chief of Staff for Mexico's Secretary of State, and a member of the Peace Commission that negotiated the ceasefire in the Chiapas Zapatista Rebellion. One of the reasons that I enjoy doing forum introductions is that I get a chance to meet extraordinary people. One of the reasons I don't is that I actually get quite intimidated and feel like, you know, gee whiz. This is one of those occasions where both feelings are deeply felt. He's one of the leading authorities on economic and political impact of the life sciences. Fortune magazine profiled him as Mr. Gene. That's G-E-N-E. He's on the board of Harvard Medical School Genetics Advisory Council, visiting committee of the David Rockefeller Center, Institute for Genomic Research, the John Crane Venter Institute, just to name a few. He's also a graduate of Harvard University, a 1981 graduate, which again allows us to claim complete credit for his remarkable thing. He's an art collector, regular journalist. He has a weekly column in the leading Mexican newspaper, Reforma. So he's a man of many talents, and again, the kind of person that we aspire to learn from and provide and teach going forward. So without further ado, Juan Enriquez. Thank you.
So for some of you, it's been kind of a long day, so I thought we'd keep this short and sweet and hopefully somewhat funny. And what I want to do is, because this is an extraordinary occasion that celebrates various countries and knowledge from various places, I'd like you to go back 500 years and imagine what the headlines in a newspaper might have looked like 500 years ago. So let's pick a random newspaper. Let's call it the Renaissance Times. What might these people have been writing about? And because it's an Italian paper, yeah, just to pick some random headlines. The really interesting thing about this is how little the world changes, because these are the headlines that you see in USA Today. And what's really important about changing the world isn't what's on the headlines, it's what's behind the headlines and often what doesn't get reported. So one of the things that wasn't in the paper is something that looked like this. But of course, something that looked like this changed the destiny of a country and made it the richest nation on earth. And unfortunately, it wasn't recognized at the time, so the person who did this was never painted during his lifetime. There was never a statue, there was never a portrait, there was never an etching of this person. He died penniless and his name was Columbus. And this is one of the first maps of the Americas. It's the island of the Hispaniola, today Dominican Republic, and Haiti. But that wasn't a headline. And by the way, nor was this. So this is the first printed map of the Americas. And if you look at this, it's a little ridiculous because Japan is sitting off the coast of California. And Columbus, who thought he'd landed in a different place, he thought he was in a different continent, which is why Native Americans are called Indians sometimes. Well, these folks had found the Indians. Look up in the top left-hand corner about where the Eskimos live. Now, you look at this map today and you sort of say, why in the world would somebody navigate with this map? Because the alternative was navigating with a blank sheet of paper. And you don't have to wait to have a perfect map or a MapQuest or a Rand McNally version before you start to move. Because early maps sometimes make a big difference. Early maps determine who's rich and who's poor. The other thing that determines wealth and what happens to countries is code. And it's the ability to read languages and code, because the difference between a human being and a monkey is about 1.23% of gene code. So if you take a human genome, which is inside each of your cells, it's 3.2 billion letters. It folds into a trillionth of an inch. If you stretch it out, it stretches out into 6 feet. If you lay that next to a monkey's DNA, the difference between a man and a monkey is about 1.23% of gene code, which is why you sometimes get the congressional debates you get. But the real difference between human beings and monkeys is that human beings learn across time. So what humans do that no other animal does is they code in things that look like this. So there's no animal that writes on cave walls. They don't tell you this is how you do fire, this is how you have a baby, this is how you do music. That's enough to generate a tribe. That's enough to tell you what I learned 10 days ago, 10 months ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The difference between tribe and empire is here, you're still dealing with pictographs, but you've standardized the language. So all of a sudden, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt can read that. That says Juan Enriquez. And it's portable, because you can put it on papyrus. And that means that you can have a tax system, you can have a civil service, you can coordinate armies, you can teach armies what other people had, you can have a school system that teaches people the same thing across time and transmits data. The masters of this, of course, are these folks, which leads to the question, why are we all not speaking Chinese yet? And the answer to that is this is a hard language to code in. If you want to use a computer, it's 17 keystrokes per key. So what we did is we collapsed language into a notation system that's 26 letters in English and 29 letters in Spanish. And that allows us to transmit a lot of knowledge very effectively across time very quickly. We can make people literate, we can print, we can do a lot of things. And what happened over the last 30 years is the language changed again. And it's the people who understand these changes in language, which aren't on the front pages of the paper, that get rich. It's countries that become functionally illiterate in the dominant language that get poor. What happened 30 years ago? We moved into a language that looks like this. So if I'm in a good mood in the morning, I will send you an email that has the first line of code, and you will receive something that says, I love you. If I'm in a bad mood, I will switch out the green for the purple, and then it says, I hate you. So the difference between love and hate is whether you get green or purple. Now the interesting thing is, I've collapsed every language into ones and zeros. I don't need separate alphabets. It doesn't matter if I'm transmitting Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Spanish or English. I can digitally code it across this microphone, across a computer, across anything. So I've standardized all languages, all alphabets, all transmission systems, and oh, by the way, I can transmit any piece of music and any image without a separate notation system. Because in 26 letters, I need a pentagram to show you how the song goes. or I need a photograph, or I need an etching. But in this language, I've collapsed every word written and spoken, every piece of music, and every image. And that makes this the most powerful coding system that we had ever seen until very recently. And it's the countries that learned that, a language that almost nobody spoke in 1960, that are today the world's dominant economies. And the reason for that is because 93% of the data transmitted in the world today is transmitted in digital code. It really makes a difference if you understand this stuff. And just as in 1900, you couldn't do diplomacy if you didn't speak French, and you couldn't do science if you didn't speak German, today you better speak digital and understand what digital can do, because if you don't, you become like Argentina instead of like Korea. Here's what happened to the global economy. You had a nice, well-balanced global economy in 1960, 1/3 agriculture, 1/3 services, 1/3 manufacturing. It went to over 2/3 knowledge and 4% agriculture. Guess who got rich and who got poor and how fast it happened? If there's one message that I'd like you to take away today, it's that the language is changing yet again. So in 1953, Watson and Crick came up with this notion that all life forms on this planet, all plants, all bacteria, all animals, all humans, and all politicians are all coded in the same stuff. And think of it as a spiral staircase. The rungs of the staircase are adenine, threonine, guanine, cytosine, A, T, C, G, all life, coded in 4 letters. And as you look at these life forms, this is a contemporary photograph of DNA done by Davidson out of Florida State. It is an incredibly beautiful molecule. All life is coded in a molecule that looks like this. And if you stick it in machines like this, you can generate about 100 million letters of gene code every day. These are now the world's largest databases. And as you look at these databases, you can write incredibly boring books. Hundreds of thousands of these pages of A, T, C, A, A, G, A. All right, go to sleep, except that what that does is it makes this thing an operating system. It makes this thing the equivalent of a computer. Except this thing doesn't operate by plugging it into the wall. It isn't complicated. This thing operates by doing this. And when it does that, it executes the first line of code. A, T, A, A, C, A, G, G, and that means make a root. Next line of code, T, C, A, G, A, make a stem. Next line of code, G, C, A, make a flower that's white, that blooms in the spring, that smells like this. All of that is coded like this. And then the last lines of code say, now repeat the code again. And you make another orange or tangerine. If I change a couple lines of code inside that tangerine, it executes a different function. So in the same way as if I change 1s and 0s, it goes from I love you to I hate you. If I change a couple lines of code in this, this becomes an orange, or it becomes a grapefruit, or it becomes a lemon, or it becomes a vaccine against cholera. So if you came to the Kennedy School today to figure out the secret of life and what life is code. And fortunately, it's imperfectly transmitted, because if it was perfectly transmitted, then you would all be clones. That, of course, leads to evolution. And by the way, evolution is not just a theory. There is reasonably definitive proof of this stuff. The difference between this creature and this creature is 1 in 1,000 letters. Very, very small changes in gene code make the difference between yourself and your neighbor. You and the person sitting next to you vary by 1 in 1,000 letters. But very small changes in punctuation can make a huge difference. You can take a perfectly straightforward declarative sentence, and there might be 2 groups in this room. There might be one group that would argue, and then there might be a second group that might say, and this is the reason why. Some of you will sometimes get sick, and you will take a chemical compound and it will cure you. And then you'll take the same chemical compound and it'll make you very sick. Because you'll have side effects and you'll be cured by exactly the same compound going into both of your bodies, because you've got a semicolon where he's got a comma. And in the measure that we begin to understand this, a lot of businesses in this world change. Insurance changes. Medicine changes. Nutrition changes. the environment and how we understand it changes. Almost every business in this world is going to change as we begin to understand life code. Because today you can take a chip the size of a credit card and test every person in this room for 60,000 genetic conditions, and break down things like leukemia into 4 entirely different diseases that are treated differently even though the symptoms are completely similar. We are now modifying foods, and we're doing so in very specific ways, not just to make them drought tolerant, not just to make them salt tolerant or tolerant to glyphosates. We are also modifying them in the same way that the leaves out here turn red in the fall when it gets dark and cold. So this particular Danish company has taken that gene pathway that makes leaves turn red, and it's changed it so the leaves turn red when they're exposed to TNT. That means you plant these seeds all over the place, you get these nice green fields, except where there are little red circles. In those places, there are landmines, and plants have become biodetectors. You can also use plants to detect things like pollution, or things that you would want to mine. You can also modify bacteria. This was done last week. So what they did is they spliced in some photoreceptors into E. coli in such a way that the E. coli would act like a photograph. Now what's interesting about this thing is it has about 10 times the resolution that you get on a very high definition picture. This has a higher resolution than the pixels that you have on the high definition televisions. It's about 100 million megapixels per slice. This is a company that's near here, and what they did is they took a gene code out of an almost extinct animal's mouth. They took that cell code, inserted it into a fertilized cow's egg, stuck the cow's egg back into the cow, and gave birth to an entirely different species by reprogramming that egg. This is what a modern gene cloning lab looks like. These are pictures I took in Argentina a couple of months ago. These guys did 60 embryo transfers in one morning. You walk out of this lab and you run into an incredibly friendly cow that thinks it's a Labrador Retriever. So you pet the cow, and as you're petting the cow, these 2 characters show up. And these 2 characters look an awful lot alike, among other things because they're clones. And in fact, they look a lot like this one. And the reason why is because they took a few cells out of the right ear of this cow, took the gene code out of those cells, inserted that gene code into a fertilized cow's egg, inserted that egg back into a cow, and gave birth to 2 clones. Which leads us to the modern cloning laboratory, which looks like this. So this is a vet who's got his left hand way up the back of the cow. He's holding an ultrasound in his right hand, and he placed 60 cloned embryos in one morning. Which is why when you walk out of here, there's a lot of cows that look alike, walking around the Argentine pampas. Now what's curious about these animals, I'm running around, I did not expect to find this in Argentina, so I'm running around taking pictures like a madman. And this very friendly Argentine cowboy called a gaucho shows up. Says, "But Che, why are you taking so many pictures? Don't you understand? They're all the same, okay?" This is a more interesting creature. So this was born recently, and the reason why this one's interesting is because it's a clone that's had specific gene code modified for a function. Make a long story short, this animal produces a medicine used to treat cancer called EPO in its milk. And every clone of this animal will produce EPO in its milk. Because of that, 20 of these cows can substitute to this factory that you see right down here on the river. This company down the river is not using cows, it's using sheep for similar biomanufacturing purposes. That, of course, leads to the question, should we be cloning humans? Well, I think we should not. Because if you clone humans, you can get absolutely horrendous results. You've got to be really careful. But cloning humans doesn't mean you shouldn't be asking what's for dinner. This is something that when you used to see 3 wings on a chicken, it was a horrendous accident. Something had gotten into the water, there was radiation, something had gone horribly wrong. In this case, this is a perfectly rational Harvard Medical School professor called Cliff Tabin, who's deliberately growing these things on chickens. The reason why he's doing so is for the same reason why when you used to play with lizards as kids and the tail fell off the lizard, you didn't worry, because the tail regrows. But if you take a human being, you take off an arm or a leg, it doesn't regrow. But go back to the beginning of the story. Every one of your cells, with the exception of some blood cells, contains your entire gene code. That gene code already made one arm, two arms. And therefore that gene code, if we understand the pathways, should be able to make various body parts. In fact, all of your body parts. And as we learn how to make extra wings on chickens, or extra skin on humans, or corneas, or bone, or even organs at some point, we will add 20 or 30 years of life to your kids, and a lot of quality of life. So if there is a message to a series of countries, to a series of industries, to a series of regions, it would be change is coming your way, and it's coming fast. This is something which is driving countries. If you lose your smart people, if you don't attract smart people, you can go downhill very, very quickly. Here is one measure of what differentials look like in the world today. It takes about 3,000 Americans to generate one patent. And by the way, generating patents matters when 2/3 of the global economy is knowledge. It takes about 4,000 Japanese, 6,000 Koreans, 14,000 Englishmen, 14,000 Frenchmen, 780,000 Argentines, 1,200,000 Mexicans. Guess who gets rich, guess who gets poor, and guess how fast it can happen. And that's part of the reason why when you ask yourself, who are the most productive people on Earth? Who's on top keeps changing. And you all know that the most productive people on Earth today are the citizens of Luxembourg, generating 1/3 more wealth per person per year than does the average American. What you know, when you know it, how you teach your kids really matters. If you don't believe that, think about sitting in this particular seat. This is the cabinet table at 10 Downing. So this is where Tony Blair sits, and that's where Major sat, and that's where Thatcher sat, and Churchill. And in 1902, the person sitting here was a guy called Robert Cecil. When Robert Cecil looked at the world, the entire world was a highway of the empire. Everything was a pathway to get to home. Now, if you'd asked the people sitting around here in 1902, what do you suppose this map will look like 50 years from now? It's conceivable they could have gotten it slightly wrong, because those 11 million square miles have now become about 89,000 square miles, and even the core of the island is breaking up. That, of course, leads to an interesting question. If you were sitting in the White House today, and you asked yourself the question, what will the map of the most powerful empire in the world look like circa 2055? Well, the answer may not be immediately obvious, because throughout the world, country after country is deciding to split, secede, restructure, rework itself, and change its borders in various ways. The U.S. is one of the very few stable places in the world. In fact, as the number of borders and countries has tripled in Africa, Asia, and Europe, in Christian, communist, Muslim, Buddhist countries, the American hemisphere has been stable. And that is a real outlier, because the last truly new border was Panama in 1903. That leads to the obvious conclusion. Well, is that true? Right? Countries are fragile entities that you have to take care of. That leads to one basic question. Now, why would I ever ask a question like this? Among other things, because there has yet to be a single U.S. president buried under the same flag he was born under. This has never been a stable system. And you win some, and sometimes you lose some. And in fact, if you look at the flags of the Philippines and of Liberia, and of Panama, and of Cuba, they're all red, white, and blue. They all have stars and stripes. Guess why? But overall, this has been a remarkably steady growth. Maybe it'll continue, maybe not. There are arguments that are easy to make as to how this becomes a larger, more powerful country with more stars in its flag in 50 years. Those are easy. Because over the course of 5 lifespans, This has been an extraordinary story of growth. But there are some trends that we may want to look at today that are important trends. One of the things we're doing is we're spending an awful lot of money that our ancestors gathered. Average debt per family today is about $84,000. And the present value of net debt today, of the promises that we made people were going to pay per household, is about $473,000. And that may not be a sustainable system. Second thing you might want to look at is problems in reading, writing, and arithmetic. If the U.S. is 17th on the third international math and science tests, that's not a problem if it competes with Latvia. But the first 5 people on those tests are people that the U.S. is running a really massive budget deficit with, and in a few decades, 90% of the scientists and engineers in the world will be in Asia. There's also a political polarization. What we hear, what we read, how we understand the world tends to be very polarized. This is simply one measure of it. This is a guy called Valdis Krebs, and what he did is he simply mapped on Amazon, when you buy a book, it says if you like this, then read this. So he mapped that stuff. And it turns out that people who are conservative tend to exchange a lot of books, and people who are liberal tend to exchange a lot of books. But there's one point of contact between them in terms of the books they read. And that is Bernard Lewis's What Went Wrong. The other thing that's important is there's a whole series of people being left behind, particularly African Americans, Hispanics, and a series of people at the bottom. From 1938 through 1968, if you worked hard, if you earned the minimum wage, you got closer and closer to that red line, which is getting out of poverty. From 1968 through the present, even if you work your tail off, if you don't have the knowledge, it's harder and harder to make your way out. It's harder and harder to reach that American dream, and you're farther and farther from the poverty level. Let me close on an optimistic note. As all this stuff is happening, each of you has a front seat on the Renaissance. There are going to be changes having to do with stuff that are within 2 miles of this place right here. They're absolutely extraordinary. Some will come in robotics, some will come in nanotechnology, some will come in life sciences, but we are going to double the sum of data generated by human beings in the next 5 years. There will be people, companies, industries, and countries that will adapt, and there are some that won't. But the speed of change is astonishing. I got on a boat with this guy who sequenced the human genome 1.5 years ago. Nice boat. And we started sampling seawater. Nothing fancy, just take water out of the surface of the sea. 5 sites. 5 sites that have been sampled for 200 years. Run it through filters, run it through those gene machines. We found 1,830 new species and increased the number of known genes from all species by a factor of 10 out of 5 water samples. We hope to double the number of species known on Earth simply by sailing around the world and testing every 200 miles. Places like this in the South Pacific, or the second largest atoll in the world, which are full of friendly creatures, are places that have extraordinary life forms that by day look like this and by night look like this. What you're watching is most of life on the planet eats sunlight. Most life on the planet, most diversity of life on the planet lives in the oceans. 85% of everything we sample every 200 miles has not been seen before. We have a linear increase in the number of protein families known on Earth, and many of these are photoreceptors, which is why the first 5 samples of water increased the number of energy transmission pathways by 2 orders of magnitude. That's part of the reason why we're putting together an energy company to make a synthetic chromosome to program cells to execute energy functions. So if there be a message in all this, don't take your country for granted. Don't take education for granted. Don't let your kids become functionally illiterate in the world's dominant language. And above all, so thank you very much.
Now I'm even more worried. So we have time for a few questions. We have microphones located here, and one up here, one right here. So if people have questions for Juan Enriquez, please step up to the microphone. If not, I'd like to start with one. You told us what's coming. You told us we should be prepared in some fashion or whatever. But we're here at a School of Government. We're talking about business, government, and so forth. What should we be doing to, in fact, prepare more effectively, to learn the lessons so that we can end up on the top of your pyramid rather than the bottom?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is don't take your country for granted. Because most people feel, you can insult half of the country and be really violent in your political speech, and it won't have consequences. A lot of people think that you can drive corporate credit, personal credit, government credit, and it won't have consequences. A lot of people feel that you don't have to deal with a series of other countries and make a series of alliances and friendship, and that won't have consequences. But then again, most flags have ended up in archaeology museums or in drawers. See, flags and borders and anthems are myths. They last only as long as the next generation is willing to support them. And if you don't give something to the next generation to fight for, to believe in, then you end up disappearing countries. And it's happening really quickly. This is a debate that's going on in Spain, it's going on in England, it's going on in a series of places. And one of the things schools of government should do is to teach these things are not steady state systems. They restructure just like companies. Citizenship is a brand. And people are becoming more and more mobile, and they've got more and more options. And as you understand countries in those terms, then you're going to be a little bit more careful with how you treat people, because people are the only thing that count. In fact, it's rich countries and natural resources that tend to be absolute disasters, because they focus on the oil, they focus on the diamonds, they focus on a series of things, and they don't focus on the people, and they get poor very quickly. Second thing I'd say for School of Government is business is going to drive this a lot faster than government. And business is actually, if you think countries are changing quickly, businesses are changing to an extraordinary extent. In 1935, if you made it into the Fortune 500, you expected to be there for 90 years. Today, you expect to be there for 14 years. So the CEOs and these businesses are just terrified. And there's a whole series of little businesses that are coming up using these new technologies that want to eat their lunch, and they want to become global businesses, and they can do so very quickly. So teaching this intersection of business and government, teaching how it is that you structure an education system and bring it together with a rational political system and a rational set of economic spending, and have businesses as your gasoline to drive this, is really important, because that's what makes countries, appears countries and disappears countries. I mean, the good news is you can make a country out of almost nothing and make it very powerful very quickly. And you have examples in Africa that have done this. I mean, the fastest growing nation on earth was Botswana, growing at about 14.1% for a period of time before it got hit by AIDS. But you can also disappear countries very quickly. And it means that the margin you have, the time you have to run government right, has shrunk, because in an agricultural economy, you treated the peasants like dirt. Didn't matter, right? Resources are still there. In the knowledge economy, you treat people like dirt for a few months, they're gone.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Josh Potashnik. I'm a junior at Harvard College. What would you say the biggest similarity is between the U.S.'s position in the world right now and Britain's position a century ago, and what do you think the biggest difference is between their relative positions?
I think there was a certain amount of arrogance and hubris around the power. And that power wasn't always matched by how some people were treated, how much of a stake they had in keeping the system as it was together. I think one of the things Britain did that's different from the United States is Britain made it illegitimate for academics to get rich. And so in things like life sciences, right? I mean, Britain is probably the smartest place on the planet per capita in life sciences. They find DNA, they find monoclonal antibodies, they find penicillin, they clone Dolly, and Dolly can't get second round funding after it clones. So it sells out to a tiny California biotech called Geron. Well, that's wrong, right? And that's part of the reason why you don't have a growth in pharmaceutical companies and really large biotech companies. You have a few examples, but it should be much larger. At the same time here, 60% of the real estate sold in Cambridge, Mass. for commercial purposes last year went to life science companies. You've got about 239 little companies that are all growing, all want to take on the pharmaceutical world, right behind the Necco candy factory, to the point where one of the largest pharmaceuticals on the planet simply offshored its entire research staff into that old candy factory. That's Novartis, which is a merger of Ciba, Geigy, Sandoz.
One of the intersections of the trends that you're talking about that comes up a lot in conversation around the country, and particularly now in periods of relative high prices in energy, but in natural resources, is the running out phenomenon. We're running out of this, we're running out of that. India and China are growing, and they're going to need all of this stuff, and we're not going to have enough stuff. And then you read the story here, and I could imagine we end up with, because of these new discoveries in genetics and biotechnology, a completely transformed world where, as Zaki Yamani once said, you know, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. I'd be interested in your view about this over a period of now decades and a century, but where are we heading?
Well, fortunately for energy traders and energy forecasters, it's a very volatile world. So if you look at it on monthly or yearly basis, then you get these extraordinary spikes. If you look at commodities on a long-term trend, the basic price of a commodity today is 20% of what it was 150 years ago. And if you're a country that's in the business of selling commodities, you're not doing so hot. So average income per capita, Saudi Arabia in 1980 was about 18,000 bucks. And it's about 10,000 bucks today. And they've got 30 to 40% unemployment. And part of that is because they focused on the oil, and they're graduating about 60% of their PhDs in religious studies. And I have nothing against religious studies, but it's very hard to IPO a billion-dollar company if that is your training. It's very different from what's happening in Korea and what's happening in Taiwan, where the fourth largest patent producer in the United States is Samsung. And as you look at this stuff, if there is a need for alternative energy sources or conservation or X, Y, or Z, yeah, it'll be driven by price. I mean, markets work. They can be very painful in the way they work. But the countries that have been oil producers just haven't learned this lesson. And that's why if you want to look at economic disaster stories, you look at the largest producer of oil in Africa, which is Nigeria. You look at Venezuela. You look at Mexico. You look at countries that have been oil rich. It's not good, and it's not just the Middle East. In fact, the largest oil producer of them all used to be the Soviet Union, which is no more.
Up here. Hi. Yes, my name is Alex. I'm an undergraduate at the college here. You spoke about the effects of the sort of life science revolution having on demographics, basically extending our lifespans, and sort of coupling that with sort of recent trends in Western nations or post-industrialized nations of having sort of the birth rates decline and the sort of percentage of elderly making up the population increase. Couple that with what a lot of your rhetoric of how all these new innovations are being dealt by new incoming people and sort of younger folks. How do you think this might have an effect in sort of perhaps a more long-term future in terms of innovation and development? If, for example, we're extending our life span and we're having a larger, sort of more elderly population, and we're therefore having a shrinking sort of younger group or population to sort of come up with new ideas or revolutionize things.
Well, see, for a long time, one of the great American myths was one person, one man, one vote, right? Because it was only if you were white and owned property, and then gradually it became that African Americans could vote and Hispanics could vote, and then even eventually Native Americans could vote, and even women. But one of the things that we've done is we've disenfranchised those who we have to invest in. So today we're spending about 22,000 federal budget dollars per person over 65 and 2,000 federal budget dollars per person under 16. Now that's about a 10 to 1 ratio that's growing, and it's likely to become 12 to 1 or 15 to 1. And so we're investing in what was as opposed to what's coming in federal terms. I understand that municipally there are differences, but there's a series of regional inequalities that will have consequences of that. What I think we have to do is I think we've got to take this one person, one vote thing seriously. And one of the things that I would advocate doing is giving every parent who has a child under 18 a proxy vote per child. Because if you don't do that, then the power of the block of elderly as this baby boom generation moves through is going to continue funding all of these massive entitlement programs over here and cutting the programs over here. And if you don't have a constituency for education, and you don't have a constituency for investing in youth, and you don't do what Taiwan is doing, and what Singapore is doing, and what China is doing in terms of where it's putting its money, then you're going to end up with a situation where you're taking care of what has been there as opposed to what's coming. And that can have real consequences going forward. We really have to start investing in kids and education and making them literate in this stuff, because it's going to come at people very quickly.
Lee Williams with Fidelity Investments. I understand that there's this raging debate between those who believe that the technologies you mentioned, nanotechnology, robotics, genomics, pharmaceuticals, will create some very rapid, virtually out of control, almost cataclysmic change in our civilization. And those who believe that we will, as a civilization, find a way to control those advances in a much more constructive way. Do you have a view as to whether we're headed to some singularity, or if we'll have still maybe radical evolution, but one which we exhibit some self-control?
It's a little bit like those headlines that I showed at the beginning. One thing that newspaper editors just love: the world is going to end, right? So they can tell you it's going to end because of nanotechnology, or because of robotics, or because of this, or because of that. No. What does end is countries. What does end is companies. So, there's a series of countries, and particularly comfortable countries, that really make big mistakes. You can look at France. France was the first wired country in the world. It put the internet in, 12 to 15 years before any other country on the planet, because everybody had the Minitel. And you could do things on the Minitel. You could make plane reservations, you could look up stuff, and you could do a whole series of stuff. But the smartest people in that country, the graduates of the INA, decided that only they would be allowed to program this stuff. They wouldn't have open source code. They wouldn't allow other people to come in. And guess what? The innovation didn't take place there. It took place in places like the company that used to make plastic boots for firemen, which became the most valuable company in Europe. You know it as Nokia. And what will happen is you'll have these shifts depending on which countries get so scared of this stuff that they say, we won't do stem cell research here. We won't do this kind of stuff here. Because that's different from what we've been doing. They'll be scared of people who look different. They'll be scared of people who speak different. They'll begin to restrict immigration. They'll cut back on investing in things like education. They'll polarize the politics, and they'll try and stay where they are. And that's a recipe for keeping a whole pile of empires in the past. Yeah? There'll be countries that have nothing to lose, like Singapore, that had an income per capita like Ghana in 1965. That wasn't even self-sufficient in water, and decided to invest in people and basic services for people. And guess what? It works. So I think these new technologies are enabling. I think they allow you to build countries, really powerful countries, really quickly. And I think we're going to be shocked by how fast it happens in some places. It also allows you to split countries. Because one of the really interesting things is the first people to leave countries are the rich. First part of Yugoslavia to break up was the part that was the richest that wanted to join the EU. It's not the ethnically conflicted, religiously divided parts that first leave. It's northern Italy that wants to leave, and it's basically saying, hey, why am I going to fund the rest of you kids? And when you look at the tax differentials between what some states pay in the US and what other states make and pay, if you get into a budget crunch, there's going to be some really amusing conversations.
Right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Bavendra Aliyu, and I'm lucky to be attending one of your executive sessions. The dean said he was intimidated in the introduction, but after you spoke, now I'm frightened. Frightened, particularly when you spoke about Botswana example, and now the Botswana example could reflect the example of the sub-Saharan Africa. After listening to you, I kept asking myself, what hope for sub-Saharan Africa? Maybe what I want to hear is the hope from your mouth, because, like I said, I'm frightened. But the other second question is to do with the graphic map that you put about the flags and the stars. What about the theory of culture 200 years, 300 years, and then maybe instead of having more stars, the world may end up with California going on its own, and then you have Florida and the northeastern USA going on its own. So rather than having more stars, you have restricted flags differently. Thank you.
I think that's perfectly feasible. I mean, there's one chapter in this book that argues this is a bigger nation. And it's very easy to see how more stars get added, right? It's very easy to add Puerto Rico. It's very easy to do something with the Virgin Islands, to do something with Guam, to do something with the Marianas, maybe to do something with Cuba. It wouldn't shock me if the border with Canada was open over the next 50 years and you had a virtual confederation. It wouldn't shock me if Canada remained one country, and it wouldn't shock me if it became 3 countries. Because the last time that we had this debate was 1949 when Newfoundland left Great Britain. And that debate was, should it be a part of Great Britain? Should it be a part of the US? Should it be an independent country, or should it be Canadian? And it was a tight debate. And by the way, the Canadian flag is from the late 1960s, and when you pledge allegiance to the flag of Canada today, when you become a citizen, you pledge allegiance to the Queen of England. So, I mean, there's some really interesting changes even within this hemisphere that tell you time and again these are not stable systems. Take care of them, nurture them. Don't allow this divisive nature of politics to convince half the population the other folks are wrong. Now, if you're looking at a smaller U.S., that is also perfectly feasible. Because if you look at the U.S., the most secessionist-prone part of the United States has been New England. And they tried to write the right to secession into the Constitution. The reason they did it in their debates was, as this country expands south and west, we will cease to control our destiny. So we want a right to opt out. And they tried to do it 4 times. Right? And, you know, these are debates that are going on right now as to whether you actually split states in places like Oregon, where there are 9 senators in favor of splitting the state, because you've got a very conservative east and a very liberal west. And something similar is taking place in parts of Maine, and something similar could take place as the Hispanic population in the United States grows, depending on how you treat the Hispanic population. When you've got 27% of the PhDs in the U.S. going to Asian Americans, 2% going to African Americans, and 1% going to Hispanics, you're going to rapidly have differentials in wealth creation. So the answer for the United States is be careful with how you treat people, be careful in how you educate people, and it's the same exact answer for Africa. I mean, what's really neat about Africa is you can build countries quickly. You can fix things quickly, right? You don't have to go over and take over your neighbors because they've got mines or because they've got land or because they've got a lot of people. You can take small countries and make them very successful. You can do it in very bad neighborhoods. You just go to the United Arab Emirates. It's pretty extraordinary what these guys are building. There are parts of Africa that are pretty extraordinary. So you can do it, right? I mean, you can do it in Vietnam, which is a communist country destroyed. I mean, every disadvantage, they're growing like hell because they're investing and focusing on education. But until you start treating education like we treat varsity sports and have 2-a-day practices and get people cut from the teams and have a discipline into those and expect people to produce, this if you pardon my French bullshit about, you know, we're not going to leave anybody behind. All right, fine. Tell you what, why don't we print on the back of your birth certificate a high school graduation diploma? Because if everybody has a right and there's no standard, well, hell, let's just give everybody a diploma. So that's what it's worth. And this drives me nuts in Latin America, where you've got people right now in political campaigns arguing everybody should have access to the university regardless of how they test. Really?
Right here.
Bill Rosenberg, a senior fellow here at the Kennedy School. If you were advising the investment advisor of the Harvard endowment, what would you tell them to invest in?
I think the gentleman who asked me the question up there is far more qualified than I am from Fidelity. Or we've got a series of people in our front row here who are a lot more qualified. I am very good at losing money on life sciences. I've become almost a professional at doing that. I would tell you, if you're going to go into this field, first understand just how broadly this has already happened. Because some of the largest U.S. corporations are already life science corporations. And General Electric is actually, you know, merging with a pharmaceutical company. So here's the premier manufacturing company going out becoming a finance company and now buying Amersham. and moving mostly into healthcare, to the point where Immelt is now spending an entire day of his time with 20 people in a room looking at this stuff. Healthcare costs for large U.S. corporations have gotten to the point where they sometimes exceed the entire profits of a year. And that's a system that's a non-stable system. It's a system that's growing very quickly, and that may not be sustainable. So as you look at that, that's a big issue. Investing in energy, I think energy production is going to change. See, our lives are going to change in such fundamental ways it's very hard to conceive of. One of the things that we're beginning to learn is how to tie molecules to very specific spots. And that sounds really abstract, except that it tells you you can have a molecule that only ties to a cuticle. Because of that, an industry as large as cosmetics can change in a fundamental way, because you can go in to get your nails done, and instead of having somebody paint them for half an hour, you just dip them into the stuff, and it only sticks to the nail. That also changes the paint industry, because if you can get paints that only tie to wood, then you don't have to mask everything, or only tie to glass. And that whole ability to just manipulate how life is structured is going to move across things like insurance very quickly. If you can test everybody for 60,000 genetic conditions, you know, I don't see how we're not going to have a genetic non-discrimination law that's going to be pretty blunt. Because I don't see who's going to make the distinction. You can discriminate for 39,406 conditions, but not for 16,403. I think it's simply going to go no fault. And that's going to change the entire insurance model. Even medicine's going in a really interesting way. See, what we're beginning to do is we're beginning to move towards a model that's predictive. And that's not a binary system. It's not you're sick, you're not sick. Take a medicine, don't take a medicine. That's a system where people, doctors, are going to come to you and say, here's your probability, lifetime probability of getting cancer, breast cancer. But because you have this specific condition, you're right-shifted on this curve. Now, that's not a problem if your doctor has an hour to explain probability theory to you, or if we taught it in schools. But it's going to be a real problem because you've got 60,000 of these charts. They're coming at you. They're growing on a monthly basis. And I think the software and the interpretation of healthcare stuff is going to become as important as the management of the molecules. And that means that the value is going to move out of the hardware, out of the pharmaceuticals, and the competitors in healthcare are going to start becoming companies like Google or like Microsoft, or, by the way, the largest project at IBM today is called Blue Gene, and the largest project at Compaq was deciphering the human genome. So as you actually look across the economic landscape, you're already seeing a massive change because of this life sciences. Understand it first and then buy a diversified portfolio, because most of these folks are going to go belly up. But the others are going to generate the world's largest companies. It's a really interesting system.
I'm afraid this is going to have to be the last question, so I'd like to call on someone who could advise the Harvard Corporation how to spend their money. Charmine Mossavar-Rahmani.
Thank you. As you go through all of these various points, and you talk about how life will change in so many ways, and you give examples of different things, I think of that picture with the chicken with 3 wings. I think that's great. Kentucky Fried Chicken can special order them for those who like chicken wings. On the other hand, I also think of your comment about how if we have the ability to, somebody's arm is cut off like the lizard tails, another one will grow. Then you also mentioned that business will be ahead of government. Well, business with great profit motives can create bodies that will have all extra parts so they could be sold. You can go through science fiction movies and think about the worst outcome. And with business being ahead and profit motives always being a key driver all over the world, where do you see this going, where we actually will be different as human beings? As they now talk about all the growth drugs where people want their kids to be taller, and so the average already over the last 20 years is 1 inch taller, right? So where does one draw the line so that we actually don't lose who we are just as human beings and become something completely different? The risks seem significant, and where does one draw the line? How do you know why it won't evolve for the worse as opposed to just great cures for cancer?
You know, that's a really interesting debate. And it's coming incrementally, right? So right now you can have a series of implants into your ear that can restore your hearing, or maybe it can give you extraordinary hearing. And you're beginning to see a whole series of things, for instance, in sports, where a series of naturally occurring things in your body can generate pretty extraordinary results. And when they start testing star athletes that seem to achieve superhuman feats, it actually turns out that some of these chemicals occur in those people at a higher rate because they've got a higher, ability to absorb or transmit oxygen, because their muscles, I mean, there's extraordinary cases of babies who are born with muscles that are just really strong. When they're very young kids, often they end up being extraordinary at sports. But okay, so if these kids are born with that and it's natural, should my kid have it? And in parallel to this whole revolution, you can get really strange with this stuff. The question that I think you implied over there on singularity is a guy over at MIT called Ray Kurzweil, who just put out a book on singularity, and his argument is, look, systems that double are very powerful. So a computer today is an incredibly stupid machine. And 18 months before that computer has the same processing power of a human brain, it will have half, at most, of your processing power, and it'll look incredibly stupid. But it takes a long time for us to evolve. Machines evolve very quickly, and 18 months after that machine reaches this, it will have twice the processing power of a human brain. And then it'll increase on this curve structure. And by the way, that's about 2015. And by about 2050, a laptop should have the processing power of every human being on the planet. And that leads to a series of really interesting questions of interaction of these things. My own version is not an apocalyptic version. I'm not Bill Joy. I think what we're going to do is we're going to go through the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution, where we spent almost all human lifetime toiling away, and suddenly you put 1,000 horsepower in the hands of people. And it was those nations that had 1,000 horsepower that became rich, and it's the nations that had 2 billion people that became poor. China and India went from being 40% of the global economy to being about 3.4% before they started reforming. But as you're looking at that stuff, I think we're on the verge of an industrial revolution where we're able to augment not just our physical force, but our mental force. And I think we'll do it by the equivalent of 100 horsepower, 1,000 horsepower, 10,000 horsepower. And that's going to be a really interesting question, because it begins to really empower individuals as opposed to countries. And that's a really interesting system, and that's part of the reason why we can't afford to leave all these continents behind. Because there will be a series of very powerful people who will have veto power over the rest of us and our free markets and our charging ahead on technology and the rest of the stuff. You can't just abandon whole sectors of the world and expect that they won't come encroach on your party, particularly as you devolve this power into individuals. One of the places where that might happen is biological warfare. At the same time, your children will have extraordinary opportunities. Your children will live in stuff, that will seem to you, I mean, somebody said, and I forget who it is, the really great science is almost indistinguishable from magic. And we are about to live some really magical times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan. It's most provocative, exciting, as well as a terrifying vision. And we are enormously grateful for that look into the future. Thank you again. Have a nice evening.